Keep an eye on this tropical wave that just exited the coast of Africa. Now several of the dynamical models are beginning to develop that into a tropical cyclone as it begins to approach the eastern Caribbean. Day 9 range, we see that there is a fairly hefty tropical cyclone beginning to work its way into the southeast Bahamas. Here is the tropical wave in question that could be a greater threat as we get into the 5 to 7 day range. And even day 10, look at this, we have rapid development into what is more than likely a hurricane just to the north of Hispaniola. And sure enough, the media would be going crazy if this solution were to verify. Interests in the Northeast Caribbean are going to have to keep a close watch on that African wave, as nearly all of the models are showing significant tropical development, or at least development into a tropical storm by the time that system begins to approach your local vicinity. Now, the second system in mind has not been outlined on this map just yet, but I'm sure the Hurricane Center will do so within the next day. It's the tropical wave located here, moving into the central Atlantic now, and this has a good chance of threatening the eastern Caribbean and possibly even the southeast United States down the road. We should at least have a tropical storm in the northeast Caribbean by the 5 to 6 day range, and this very well could be a hurricane threat to the western Atlantic and possibly the eastern seaboard. Now, what could be a much more significant player in the medium and extended range is this tropical wave that is now being highlighted by the Hurricane Center Outlook. It only has a 10% chance of development within the next 48 hours, but those chances go way up as we go into the medium range. This is going to be the big one, and it's really not going to develop too fast immediately, but wait for things to change in a few days. This could be one of the biggest threats to the southeast United States since Hurricane Ike in 2008. By day 7, that trough is now fully gone, and we see that much of the mid-level ridging over the Atlantic is now expanding westward into much of the U.S. East Coast, and that's simply going to act to draw this storm straight toward the southeast United States. This is the main player that we're going to be keeping a very close watch on over the next 7 to 10 days. This is 97L Invest with a 40% chance of becoming a tropical cyclone within the next 48 hours. All the models generally take this in a west-northwest direction across much of the greater Antilles, including Hispaniola and Cuba. Once this system gets closer to the United States, it could make a run at becoming a major hurricane. Importantly, now we have 97L Invest being given a 90% chance of development. Now, if we turn to the central Atlantic, we see that our tropical wave is definitely flaring a lot more than yesterday, and it's also beginning to take up a lot more area. The environment is steadily becoming more favorable, as the models had suggested. This could still develop either here or just a little bit toward the north or toward the south, and that would have significant consequences with regard to the forecast track. More important than anything will be determining exactly where this surface circulation initially forms. When you put all of this together, the biggest threat for the United States appears to be for the Florida Peninsula. However, as we've seen, there are still quite a lot of models taking this into the southeast Gulf. So all interest in the eastern Gulf of Mexico and even up the east coast to some extent into Georgia and the Carolinas should still be keeping a close watch on this storm. This is a Sunday afternoon update on this August 21st on Tropical Storm Irene. This is the 11 a.m. official forecast from the National Hurricane Center. The Hurricane Center still believes that this storm will pass directly over some of the biggest terrain of Hispaniola. However, it must be noted that there are some indications that Irene could take both a northerly track in the short and medium range, and that is because we have seen several shifts toward the north in the center's location over the last 24 hours, and in fact we could now be facing a direct hit here in Puerto Rico from a strong tropical storm or borderline Category 1. Now, if this were to occur and the storm takes a more northerly track, then we still cannot rule out that this will pass to the north of some of the highest terrain here, and that would be bad news for the United States, as we will have a strengthening storm moving into the southwest Atlantic with plenty of time to develop over open waters and the Bahamas. Again, this is the red line denoting the official forecast track from the Hurricane Center, but notice where all of the spaghetti model plots are now located. They have shifted to the eastern side of Florida, more off the east coast, and are now implying more of a threat to the Carolinas this afternoon. This is a very favorable pattern aloft, and once this begins to move away from the greater Antilles and into the southwest Atlantic, this upper level ridge is expected to follow our storm, and that is when we can see some rather significant intensification into a very potent hurricane. Interest in the Carolinas are now expected to take a very close watch on this system. Right now you have the greatest threat of being impacted by the system in the 4 to 6 day range to begin preparing now for a hurricane landfall. In the event that this storm does take a track toward your location, you want to beat the rush toward the stores now before things get crazy, and I expect the media to really begin to pick up on this system tomorrow. Notice that the track has shifted ever so gradually now with the track on the northern end of the Hispaniola coastline, which would suggest that the storm will miss some of the more rugged terrain, and therefore we could be dealing with a stronger hurricane over the Bahamas and southwest Atlantic. I continue to see a heightened risk for Georgia and especially the Carolinas. If it stays just off the coast, which it's kind of looking like it will do so, this is going to spell major problems for the United States eastern seaboard. We're beginning to see a little bit more agreement here. Florida is not out of the woods by far, but again, this agreement and clustering is beginning to be centered more so toward the Carolinas with time. The track might be a little bit more to the east than the GFS operational is indicating. First off, we've continued to see the center drift more toward the north than forecast, and second of all, the GFS ensemble members are showing a bit more troughing over the Great Lakes and northeast. The GFS ensembles are also indicating a pattern that could be conducive for a threat all the way from Florida to Maine, as there is a good chance that this low center could track all the way up the east coast. And then as we go into day 7, much like the GFS ensemble members were indicating, this tropical cyclone is not that far off the coastline from the mid-Atlantic states, and then finally by day 8, it's still continuing to move toward the north, and it ends up in Maine. Earlier this morning, we suspected that the National Hurricane Center would begin to shift their track more toward the Carolinas, and sure enough, as of the 11 a.m. advisory, their latest forecast is now taking this towards South Carolina as a major hurricane. However, interest from Florida all the way to North Carolina and even points further north need to be on close watch for this storm, as there is a chance it could parallel the entire eastern seaboard. And we continue to see an eastward shift, even as far east as the Outer Banks of North Carolina. As soon as this begins to pull away from Hispaniola, once again, that is when we will begin to see significant intensification. As early Saturday morning, the latest GFS is showing this system narrowly missing South Carolina, but it is still showing a direct hit along the Outer Banks to the south of Wilmington and points just to the east and northeast of there before the system begins to continue moving off toward the northeast in the general direction of New England. Much of North Carolina, and especially eastern North Carolina, suffers a direct hit this particular time, and that's because the trough isn't quite as amplified. Hurricane Irene is going to develop into a major hurricane over the Bahamas, so interests there need to be preparing now for the worst case scenario. All interests from Florida to Maine need to at least be keeping somewhat of an eye on this, because even if it tracks more toward the north, it will have significantly weakened, but you can still have some very severe weather, including the risk of flooding. Notice how compared to yesterday, the track has continued to shift a little bit more toward the east. The landfall, or at least the first landfall, is directly over the Outer Banks of North Carolina near Cape Hatteras. But look out here along the mid-Atlantic and northeast states, and at this point I really do not foresee a scenario that would take the big impacts away from the eastern half of the Carolina coast. We have a well-defined eye beginning to develop here just to the southeast of the Bahamas, and this is a very problematic look for much of the islands down there, and I would not at all be surprised if this develops into a Category 3 or possibly even borderline Category 4. So we now have significant impacts being forecast all the way from the Virginia coast all the way through Maine. Irene is packing maximum sustained winds of 120 miles per hour, making this a Category 3 on the Saffir-Simpson scale. They are not ruling out the possibility of this becoming a Category 4. Irene is more than likely developing concentric eye walls. This could allow for the wind field to expand with time, so this could make for a larger hurricane. Hurricane impacts all the way from North Carolina through the state of Maine, including all of the New England states, and this is definitely on the table now. This would be a major flooding and damaging wind event here for much of eastern North Carolina, spreading into the Virginia coast, the Delmarva Peninsula, and further up into the mid-Atlantic states. Interests including Jacksonville, North Carolina, Havelock, and Greenville. All of you guys over there need to be preparing for at least hurricane force winds, and if you live in a low-lying community, especially along the coast, you need to be ready for the possibility of storm surge impacts and a lot of potential coastal and even inland flooding if you happen to live in a low-lying area. And then as we go into day 4, much like the latest GFS, the European is now indicating a due north track all the way through day 4 once again. So this is a very problematic track and scenario for much of coastal Virginia up into the Delmarva. This is a late Thursday night update on this August 25th on the latest on Major Hurricane Irene as it looks poised to strike North Carolina within the next 48 hours. And in fact, 28 storms is headed in that general location so that we can intercept Irene as it begins to cross the state. Reinforcement beginning to come out of the Midwest, and eventually we should begin to see more of a turn toward the Northeast, but not until this system begins to make a direct impact along the eastern half of North Carolina. By 8 p.m. Saturday, the center should be over the northern half of the Pamlico Sound, and then eventually as we go into overnight Saturday into the daytime hours of Sunday, the system will be going directly over the Delmarva Peninsula on its way to making a direct hit in the city of New York, with it passing directly over the Pamlico Sound. Basically the worst case scenario for many interests here along the Outer Banks of North Carolina. We are definitely not going to push our luck that far east, so we advise everyone else to do the same and get the heck out of there, because it's simply going to be a very bad situation for anyone that decides to stay. Expect some video uploads of the conditions as they become progressively worse in eastern North Carolina.